Let me start with just giving you a couple of numbers, and I promise to try not to overdo it. Every day we have updates here in Moscow on the number of infected. And this morning we got the recent numbers. So today in Russia there are 3,547 persons infected with coronavirus. I think that given the European statistics, it's not a very scary figure, but I think that we can be concerned about the dynamics. Over the last 24 hours, we have got 767 new cases, which means the increase of 28%, which is significant. Now, if you look at the geographical breakdown of these figures, you'll find out that Moscow and the suburbs of Moscow, including the place where I'm locked right now, account for about 3/4 of the national number of those infected. To give you a sense of this geographical disproportion, let me mention that in St. Petersburg, for example, the biggest city in this country, about 5 million inhabitants, the number is 147 infected people. So basically, it's clear that Moscow has to pay the toll for being the major international gateway of the Russian Federation, and some experts even argue that we have to pay the price for centralizing the air traffic in Moscow without using regional air hubs. In any case, we know that since the beginning of the pandemic, there were about 1 million people who got back to Russia from abroad. And of course, some of these people carried the virus. Even now, there are about 35,000 of Russian citizens who still find themselves in various places overseas, mostly in Southeast Asia. And there are very severe limitations on the air traffic right now in Russia. I think that Sheremetyevo can accommodate only 500 people per day, and regional airports can receive fewer than 200. So we will still have to deal with those who would like to get back but cannot do it. Now, if you look at the rate of lethal cases, we now got only 31 lethal cases in Russia, at least reported cases in Russia. And some claim that maybe these numbers will go up when the public health system is getting closer to its limits. Now, in terms of the current regime, it is called self-insulation or self-isolation. It is less than formal quarantine. It means that people have to stay at home and that they can only leave home to go to a grocery store or to walk their dogs. And the Moscow city government maintains that they will find very efficient ways to monitor our behavior using the high-tech technologies, including monitoring the smartphones and introducing cameras. And of course, the political opposition is concerned that that might be a test of what they call digital authoritarianism. Now, having said that, let me shift to the main topic of my presentation. And I have to make, I think, 3 initial disclaimers. First of all, of course, the pandemic is a moving target, and we still have very incomplete information about the number of cases, about the geography, about the breakdown, and it's a question to what extent official statistics can be fully trusted. Second, it's also clear that the discussion around the epidemic has become severely politicized. And of course, there is a competition of narratives that we should also keep in mind. And I would also say that that of course, if we are talking about the impact of the coronavirus on the international system, we should keep in mind that the virus coincided in time with many other very important and very dramatic international developments. Definitely, we can talk about the end of the economic cycle. We can talk about the collapse of the global oil prices. We can talk about escalation of a number of important regional conflicts like Libya, for example, but also Syria, and we can also talk about the situation of the election campaign in the United States. What I'm trying to say is that it is very difficult to distinguish the impact of the crisis and the impact of other important developments that we witness since the beginning of the year. But I will try to limit myself to the international implications of the coronavirus crisis, and I will limit myself to 5 observations about the changes in the international system and what these changes might mean for Russia. So first, let me say that in my view, one of the most evident implications of what we go through right now is the growing role of states in the international system. States are getting stronger, non-state actors are getting weaker. When the name of the game is not prosperity, but survival, people tend to rally around the flag. And this is something that we see everywhere. We see the private sector, civil society, think tanks, and even media are getting to the backstage with states taking the lead. That happens in Europe, that happens in France, in the United Kingdom. We see how it goes in Hungary. It happens in Asia. I think in the United States it is more complicated, but generally speaking, states are getting stronger, and I'm concerned about the fabric of social communication, which is getting thinner and thinner. We see fewer events, we see fewer contacts, borders are sealed, and I think it's a triumph of statism. The texture of social interaction is gradually disappearing. And I think that this is particularly typical for countries with very centralized political regimes. Russia is clearly one of them. I would argue that when the crisis is over, we all are likely to become more provincial than we are right now. And I think that Russia might be a very graphic example of this growing provincialism. Now, in terms of the impact of these developments on Russia proper, first of all, I think that the growing role of states is something which fits very nicely in the vision of the world shared by the Russian leaders today. They spoke about sovereignty for a long time. They spoke about nation states as major building blocks of the international system. They demonstrated their skepticism of transnational movements, transnational civil society, and transnational businesses as important actors in the international system. Second, I think that this development to some extent justifies the strategy of the Russian leadership, which it pursued for last couple of years. The strategy of self-reliance, the strategy of import substitution, and some can even argue that it is a strategy of self-isolation. Now, the Russian leaders can argue that they were able to predict something like that to come, and they are better prepared to handle the situation than some of their members. I think that definitely this situation might create some operational benefits for Russia because the crisis might distract attention of Russia's opponents from burning issues. It might create a vacuum of power that the Kremlin might be tempted to fill. However, I think that the opportunity to demonstrate comparative advantages of Russia in the international system will depend on the ability of the Russian leadership to handle the crisis more successfully than most of European nations. Right now, they show the European example, the European case, as essentially a failure. And the narrative is that in Russia, this case will not be replicated, will not be repeated, that Russia will rather follow the Asian case, meaning, of course, China, but some Asian countries as well. So my second point is that the pandemics, one of them we see right now, impose a heavy toll on multilateralism. And definitely we saw a very graphic demonstration of the demise of multilateralism by the unilateral decision of Donald Trump to close borders and to stop air traffic with the European Union without having discussed it with the US strategic allies. But of course, there are other manifestations of the decay of multilateralism. I looked at the statements made on the pandemic by G7 and G20. Frankly, I'm not very impressed. I don't think that this statement will be easily converted into an action plan. And of course, I think many of us are really appalled with the inability of the United Nations Security Council to come up with a resolution on coronavirus. We know that the Security Council, at least in the most important cases, never delegated this issue to WHO. For example, in 2020, they passed a resolution on HIV/AIDS. In 2014, there was another resolution on Ebola. And I think that the reason why we cannot get a resolution right now is because there is a very fierce information war between China, which led the Council last month, and the United States. The burden is not easy to agree upon, but it also reflects the reluctance of great powers to provide for more responsibility and authority by international multilateral institutions. So I think that definitely this demise of multilateralism happens when we need multilateralism. And for me, one of the most interesting tests will be the ability or inability of the international community to cooperate in the production of the antivirus vaccine. But right now, I see these developments evolving more like a Soviet-American space race half a century ago, rather than a concerted effort to come up with a solution that everybody would endorse. So, in my opinion, definitely multilateralism has become a victim to the crisis, though I have to say that the decay of multilateralism has not started with the crisis. It has started much earlier. And again, all of us know about how it started. I don't want to get into too many details here. So what does it mean for Russia? I think that, first of all, Russia, like the United States or China, has never been very smart and capable of multilateral foreign policy. That's why multilateralism has always been met with a degree of suspicion by the Russian leadership. Of course, the official propaganda will try to make full use of the demise of multilateralism, demonstrating the hypocrisy, quote unquote, the hypocrisy of the West when the things get really sour. All these statements, nice statements about the Western solidarity, about common values and things like that do not matter much any longer. And we will see, of course, Russian propaganda outlets making this case again and again. Now, at the same time, I don't exclude that Russia might want to demonstrate that it is not a part of the problem, but rather a part of the solution, and we can get some new proposals from Moscow. For example, it might prepare a draft of Security Council resolution. It might try to broker a compromise between Beijing and Washington. I can imagine that some such attempts can be made. Of course, a big question is whether Russia can offer anything significant in terms of fighting the crisis. We saw the first attempts to come up with specific assistance packages, and Italy is probably the most visible case. I think that it is not necessarily a purely PR action, but it is a demonstration that Russia might become a part of the solution, and it has something that it can offer to other nations. My third point is on the changing US-Chinese balance. And I think this is also a very important outcome of the crisis, no matter when we see this outcome. And there is a lot of criticism of the China's performance, especially at the initial stages of the epidemic. China was allegedly too late to act. China allegedly was hiding important information, and it was not eager to open itself to international organizations. Even if you take WHO, you'll see that China started working with this organization only in the very end of December. Human rights activists would also make a point that the way Chinese handled the epidemic included very serious violations of human rights. So having said that, I would still emphasize that it is very hard right now to make the case that the United States or major European countries have handled the virus in a better, more efficient way than Chinese have done. Of course, statistics demonstrates that the center of the epidemic has moved to Europe and to North America, and unfortunately the death toll is climbing. So I think that China can easily present its performance as a success story. And I can imagine that one of the outcomes of the current epidemic will be China rising its stature, its prestige, getting more respect from other countries, especially developing nations, but also places like Russia and other places in between Western authoritarian models and Eastern authoritarian models and Western liberal democracies. I think that the United States, to some extent, was demystified, not only in Russia, but in other places. The standard perception is that if there is a country that can handle such a difficult situation, it should be the United States, given the potential, given the flexibility of the US political system, given the resources that the United States can allocate. And I think that these epidemics, or rather the way how the United States has managed these epidemics so far, is a major setback for the image of the United States in the world. So what does it mean for Russia? I think, first of all, for the Russian leadership, this change in balance between China and the United States justifies the Asia pivot of Moscow. And it confirms what Putin has said about liberal democracy, that liberalism basically outlived itself. It is no longer responding to the problems that the mankind faces. It has become antiquated, and all that stuff. Definitely we will hear more from Moscow about that. I think that it also means that this Russian-Chinese cooperation will continue, and the strategic alliance will get more strategic, and it will get stronger. Of course, the epidemic had a negative impact on the Russians' relations to China as well. For example, we don't have too many Chinese tourists in the streets of Moscow, and the social dimension of this relationship has always been rather weak. I would also predict that we will see a very significant decline in the Russian-Chinese trade this year, but this decline will result primarily from the collapse of the energy prices, not from the epidemic itself. So, in a sense, I think what we saw right now might accelerate the move towards a bipolar world, with China getting strong in relative terms and the United States getting weaker. It will have very serious repercussions for everybody. I think that it will not necessarily meet Russian interests, because Russia will pay a price for this bipolar system, especially if this system becomes a rigid bipolar system. Russia maintain its partnership with China. Russia will have to sacrifice some of its contacts with other partners, which will find themselves on the other side of the barricades. For example, a bipolar world will definitely have negative implications for Russia's relations with India, which remains a very important partner for Moscow in Asia. My fourth point is the implications of the epidemic on the north-south balance. And right now, the global south is not directly affected by the epidemic, and there are various explanations why it is the case. Some would say that it's because of climate, that the virus doesn't like high temperatures. Others would say that the developed world is not really engaged in many of the transnational connections, and that's why it is lagging behind. Some would say that it's about testing, about statistics, also about the demographic structure, and that basically the virus affects mostly the older generation, and the South is young, the North is old. That's why there is an apparent discrepancy here. But the reality is that nobody knows for sure why the South is not affected, and how long the South luck is going to last for. We're working right now on a report on various scenarios of the geographical expansion of the virus, and I have two major scenarios for the global South. I think that in the best case scenario, we will see the South relatively little affected by the virus. And in the worst case scenario, we will have a global disaster of an epic scale, which might start anywhere in the South. For example, Cairo or another large metropolitan area in the Middle East or in Africa can be affected and can implode. And of course, in this case, all the problems that we confront today might pale in comparison to what we are likely to see. But I don't want to go into detail here, but definitely, even if the impact on the South is relatively marginal, we're likely to see more social polarization. We will see economic construction, also because the epidemic coincides with the collapse of energy prices. We will see fewer investments in the South, more pressure on social and political systems, more authoritarianism, more failed states in the South, specifically in the Middle East and maybe in the North Africa as well, and more international terrorism. For Russia, it means that it might get tactical opportunities, but also strategic challenges. In terms of technical opportunities, one can argue that with the Western attention diverted from the global South, Russia might see a vacuum of power, which it can use to meet its objectives. One can also argue that basically in the South, we are likely to see more anti-Western sentiments, and we already see anti-Western moods growing in Africa, for example, but we are also likely to see more anti-Chinese sentiments there. Many in Africa believe that China really infected African countries, and therefore Russia might stay there as a relatively neutral power with certain comparative advantages. Now, it is also important that Russia might try to enhance its influence in Africa at a relatively low cost. So my take is that if Russia is likely to be engaged in the South in a more substantial way, it will use the Libyan model rather than the Syrian model. The Libyan model is more about geoeconomics rather than about geopolitics. Russia, in case of Libya, does not punch above its weight, and it is able to avoid owning the country, trying to preserve good relations with all the sides in the conflict. Here again, I don't exclude some limited opportunities for Russia's cooperation with the West, and probably the first test of these opportunities will be Yemen, because in case of Yemen, I don't see real contradictions between Moscow and Washington, for example. There are some nuances, there are minor disagreements about, for example, the role of Iran, but generally I think it is easy to reconcile the two positions. And if Yemen works out fine, maybe we can see new, more ambitious joint ventures in this part of the world. Now, finally, in terms of the consequences and the repercussions of the virus, let me say that we should also, of course, there'll be changes, but we should not forget about the resilience of the current international system. I think it's very unlikely that we will see a major redistribution of resources in the West away from the NATO alliance. And as I understand, there was a ministerial today, and there should be a press conference by Secretary General, but I would be very surprised to see that there are any changes in the NATO posture. I think that though there is a crisis within the European Union, but this crisis, in my humble opinion, is not really deeper than the crisis of migrations that we saw in 2015, 2016. The European Union is even committed to go on with its enlargement. So I think that we should not underestimate the resilience of the European Union with all the problems notwithstanding. I don't see any changes in the US policy, especially on international sanctions, on issues like Iran. We see even a stronger pressure on Venezuela. We see new sanctions imposed on Russian public companies. So I don't see any readiness of the United States to yield on important issues because of the epidemic. Russia remains toxic in the United States. I don't think that anything will change this situation. It's very hard to imagine how we can resume strategic arms control. They talk about P5 meeting, but if this meeting takes place on the margins of the United Nations General Assembly in fall, I don't think it will really make a lot of difference because it will take place on the eve of the US presidential elections. So I don't think that we can imagine a real change of the rules of the game, which implies that Moscow is likely to take a wait-and-see approach to see how the West is going to handle the epidemic. It doesn't exclude some moderate proposals, but I don't think that under the pressure of the epidemic, Moscow is likely to make any significant concessions. And I think that the perception in the Kremlin, to the extent I can judge about perceptions in the Kremlin, is that indeed we might all be moving in the direction of the abyss, but the West is still way ahead of Russia in this movement. And let me end with saying that a lot will depend, if not everything, will depend on the ability or inability of the Russian leadership to handle the situation. If it handles the situation well enough, better than its European neighbors, then we can see the eroded Crimea consensus replaced by a new Corona consensus. And it will definitely give the leadership another source of legitimacy and political capital that can be spent within the next couple of years. If the Russian leadership is not very successful, then I think we can see a very rapid decline of the stature of the president and the government. So stakes are really high. And finally, I think that my time has already run out. Let me say that I am old enough to remember times of great changes. And I do remember that in the end of 1980s, we had something not exactly like we have today, but something similar. It was clear that something was going to change. And the leadership was in a situation of disarray. I think that really makes think tanks even more important than they were in regular times. The value of ideas is likely to grow. That's why I think that those of us who are engaged in think tanks should try not to waste these good crises. Thank you.